time to hear from our first panel. I'm pleased to welcome Jennifer Granick, Surveillance and Cybersecurity Counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union. She favors expanding the right to privacy and increasing the control that individuals have over their personal information. And Meredith Griffanti, Managing Director at FTI Consulting. She co-leads the firm's cybersecurity, data privacy, communications, and provides crisis counseling to companies experiencing cyber attacks and privacy investigations. Thank you so much for being here today. And I wanted to begin this conversation by asking you both kind of a top-down question about how the last year in major cyber attacks has really changed the approach to both consumer privacy and also to communicating with consumers when that privacy is compromised due to these breaches, and for either of you to take.
I'm happy to start, Maggie. Thank you so much for that question. It's a really good one. Post-Colonial Pipeline, post-JBS, Kaseya, I think that ransomware in particular has become more of a common subject to be covered in the media. I think the awareness amongst not only clients, but consumers, regulators of how these attacks happen and the impact that it can have on consumers' day-to-day lives is so important. And then you add in, obviously, the new guidance from OFAC and the Department of Treasury. And there's really been an encouragement, amongst the private sector to work with the federal government, work with law enforcement, to be more transparent in their communications about being a victim of ransomware attacks, to do things like proactively share threat intelligence with law enforcement, particularly indicators of compromise and other helpful threat intelligence to, as Madam Secretary said, work on attribution of these threat actors. So that kind of shift in getting out ahead of the messaging, talking to consumers or clients if you're the victimized organization quickly and making sure that they're the ones that break the news and really control the message has become, I think, quite important. And then I think, having seen Colonial and JBS, I think that really put into perspective the physical disruption and operational disruption that cyber incidents can have in day-to-day lives of our American public. So it's been a wild year, to say the least.
I would say from the perspective of the public, I think people have a renewed understanding of the importance of information security and protecting their personal data from outsiders. I think you see that in, sort of an uptick in use of secured communications. Whether people are concerned with security and they use WhatsApp, or there's news that suggests that WhatsApp isn't as secure as people think, and then they move to a different application such as Signal. I think there's more concern on, the part of legislators and states all around the country in passing consumer privacy legislation in order to try to protect this sort of information. And really, I think, a proper focus on a proactive security-focused effort to protect people's information from unauthorized compromise.
Absolutely. And, Meredith, I wanted to ask you specifically, you served as the lead of crisis communications at Equifax in 2017 following the data breach. Can you speak to how some of this crisis communications work has changed in the years since then, as some of these attacks have only multiplied, and some of the lessons learned in the years since that massive data breach?
Sure, absolutely. I would say that, the shift has really been on the types of attacks. Obviously, Equifax was an APT, and what we're dealing with today are more financially motivated criminal groups. And the attackers have grown much more aggressive in that, now when we're dealing with these ransomware groups, we have to contemplate timely communications, consistent communications with stakeholders, but also getting to them before the threat actors get to them. Meaning, we've seen different threat actor groups take out Facebook ads to publicize their attacks. They will, I've worked for hospital systems where they will contact patients directly and threaten to release their sensitive medical information on the dark web. And this happens all the time as well. You know, the threat actors will reach out to employees of the victimized organization and let them know what's going on. So really I think, you know, the biggest lesson learned over the past few years is, again, just as Jennifer said, being prepared, having a plan down on paper that sort of marries up incident response plans, disaster recovery plans with crisis communications plans that are contemplating these types of aggressive behaviors we're seeing from the threat actors, from what we like to call their own public relations departments. You really want to put the victimized company in control of that message and have them be the ones telling consumers or patients, customers, and regulators what happened, what you're doing to fix it, who you've brought on to remediate, contain the situation, remediate, and recover quickly, what kind of workarounds you've put in place to mitigate any operational disruption, and how you're collaborating with law enforcement. I think, you know, building into those preparedness plans, outreach about what happens if your corporate email is offline. How are you going to get a note out to all employees, or how do you plan to contact your clients if you can't reach them via traditional communications channels? Those are the types of things, given these threat actors' behaviors, that we're putting into communications plans and really advising our clients to think about in advance. That, and I would say also building those relationships with regulators and with law enforcement ahead of time prior to an attack is really important, because, you know, that minimizes the risk of investigations and fines down the road. So we're encouraging our clients to really be proactive in that relationship building, so that you're not trying to also build those relationships in the middle of a crisis while you're trying to stop the bleeding.
And for Jennifer, you know, a lot of these, not all, but many of these cyber attacks take place due to a lack of cyber hygiene by some of these companies. Sometimes these cyber criminals get in through, you know, maybe less sophisticated means. Do you think, you know, there should be more of a conversation about punishing some of these companies that have these data breaches due to this lack of cyber hygiene? You know, what are your thoughts on how to handle these companies?
Well, I think an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. You know, there's what it really incentivizes companies to do better. And I think that, you know, certainly you could think about, you know, having some kind of fine. But by that time, in a lot of ways, the cat is out of the barn. And what you're really looking for is to try to make it worthwhile for entities to really protect the information from the get-go. And I think that means strong encryption. That means multi-factor authentication. That means data hygiene in terms of like not keeping sensitive information around for longer than it's necessary. In a number of these breaches, we see that data has been, you know, that's not needed, it's just sitting around because it's cheap to store it. So you need to have data retention laws or data retention practices that get rid of this information, so you don't have like a, you know, kind of a honeypot or a treasure trove, you know, for entities to, or for, you know, bad actors to attack. And I think that, you know, I think the prevention is more important than trying to, you know, sort of punish your way into incentives. One of the biggest incentives that we've seen that's been helpful is the breach notification rules. And the breach notification rules now, I think every state or almost every state has one, is sort of a public embarrassment to companies. When certain data of their customers is taken, they have to let people know. It helps the consumer to protect themselves from identity theft and that sort of thing. But it also is a public mark that this company has fallen short in taking care of our information. And I think that kind of transparency is really useful as well.
Well, Jennifer, you actually just teed us up to my next question, which was, I actually discussed this with Congresswoman Clark. There is quite a big effort in Congress right now to push through a federal mandatory cyber incident reporting standard. You know, what are both of your thoughts on this particular issue? And, you know, what is industry really looking for in terms of, you know, what timelines for reporting, whether they should report if they've paid ransomware? And Meredith, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think the concept of a federal breach notification standard is one that we've been talking about for a long time, and a good one. I will tell you, on the communication side of the house, we're involved in the notification process, and having to navigate through when you're working with legal counsel on these things, 50 different statutes and standards when you're trying to get these notifications out the door. Some require a media posting online, some require a notification via U.S. direct mail, and then you take into account the fact that a lot of times we're supporting multinational companies that are taking into account privacy laws in other countries. It does make it quite difficult. In terms of voluntary reporting, to the federal government, I think you're seeing more and more of that, just because, as we talked about, the threat intelligence oftentimes that you can get from law enforcement and from the authorities about these different threat actor groups, whether that's particular IOCs or threat intelligence on whether or not their decryptor tool is effective, if it's slow to work. All of those things are so helpful. I also think you're seeing a lot of companies that have gone through this do a great job of kind of sharing lessons learned after the fact for the good of the whole industry, and really to lift the entire security community up. I know that we just saw the Solar Wind CEO and the Colonial Pipeline CEO participate in one of Mandiant's conferences. And I think those kind of peer-to-peer, especially amongst industry and in particular in the critical infrastructure industry, those lessons learned and those sharing types of forums where, as Jennifer said, the companies aren't really held up as the poster child for something that went wrong, but rather are looked to as sources of information for having gone through this and having come out on the other side of it and learned a lot. So the more that we can continue to encourage that, I think the better off we all are.
I would say one of the things we see at the federal level is often an effort to kind of make less, to sort of neutralize the state laws that are being passed. And, California, for example, has a very strong data breach notification law. The proposals that we've seen for federal laws have been weaker. A similar thing with consumer privacy protection. California and New York have passed some strong consumer privacy protection legislation. The consumer privacy legislation that we're seeing proposed in Congress often isn't as strong or as protective as we're seeing. I do think there's an argument there for having a floor below which, a standard of care below which companies cannot fall, but allowing there to be some innovation in the states and some greater protections in the states as well. I think this privacy protection is really important. Our privacy laws are weak, and privacy laws are often put forward as an obstacle to cybersecurity. That's not true. A lot of information is out there. A lot of information is being shared. Some of it should not be shared. Some of it we can continue to share. But the point is that we need to push on both security and privacy if we're going to protect people's information and build that trust that we need to have, so that there is that collaboration that everybody here has been talking about is so necessary in order to address these online threats.
And in the short term, to both of you, we do see these escalating attacks, but can you go through some of the specific steps that both companies and individuals, your every man on the street, can do right now to try to protect themselves from falling victim to some of these destructive attacks?
I'm happy to start. So especially from a communications perspective, Jennifer, I'll take the companies, perhaps you can take the consumers. As I said before, really getting tight on those incident response plans, ensuring that they're coordinated and complementary to disaster recovery and crisis communications plans. And oftentimes what we see when we work with companies on the preparedness front are these, 100-page beautiful playbooks that get stuck on the shelf and never really used or practiced on. I think what we try to do is encourage companies to practice mobilizing as a team, get really tight on decision making, how certain decisions, paying a ransom, not paying a ransom, are escalated within the organization, thinking through those out-of-band communications channels that I mentioned. What do you do? How do you communicate if your corporate website is down, if your email is offline? So kind of planning for the worst there and practicing those scenarios. And really it's drilling on them. I think tabletop exercises are a term that is very well known in our industry and sometimes overused, but I cannot stress how important they are, because every time you do them, you uncover some sort of gap or some sort of weakness that can be strengthened and kind of enhanced prior to being in the middle of a crisis. So that is my best advice right now for organizations from a comms readiness standpoint.
And Jennifer, any last very quick thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's just a few things that are super important. Use secure passwords, which usually means using a password manager. Turn on multi-factor authentication, something you have, something you know. Update your software, super important. It's a reason why the government should never do anything to make people mistrust software updates. And I think shop for secure services. Make security and encryption a factor in what you purchase and what you use.
Well, I want to thank you both for taking the time to speak with us today and for appearing here on the Hill's Cybersecurity Summit. And happy National Cybersecurity Awareness Month.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie.